Antonio stood on his balcony in a tiny village perched above the Amalfi Coast. He closed his eyes. The horizon was there, a vast stretch of blue against jagged cliffs, but he did not need to see it. He drew a long breath, letting the salt-heavy air fill his lungs. Behind his eyelids, the world shifted from light to a geography of sound. He leaned his weight against the stone railing, feeling the grit of the sun-warmed masonry beneath his palms. He pushed the visual world away, narrowing his focus until the only reality was the space between the buildings. He stood perfectly still, a single point of silence in a world on the verge of movement. The morning was coming, signaled by the subtle shift in air temperature and the faint, low-frequency hum of a world beginning to stir. He held his position, waiting for the first fracture in the quiet. He did not look for the sun. He did not watch the sea. He waited for the village to speak. The stillness was not empty. It was a held breath, a pause before the day broke into its own familiar rhythm. He kept his eyes shut, listening for the first vibration of the morning. The first strike came from the bell tower, a deep, bronze note that did not just sound, it hit. The vibration traveled through the air, slammed into the stone walls of the surrounding houses, and bounced back with a hollow, metallic resonance. Antonio felt the tremor in the soles of his feet as the sound wave rolled through the alleyway. It was a heavy, deliberate tolling, a massive iron tongue swinging against a cold metal shell. The sound was not merely a signal, it was an anchor. It pulled the village out of the dark, forcing the stillness to fracture. One strike followed another, each note lingering, decaying into the cracks of the limestone before the next one pushed it out of the way. The rhythm was absolute, a clockwork heartbeat that dictated the pace of every living thing within the cliffside. The air grew dense with the tolling, a physical pressure that occupied every corner of the sky. It was the sound of authority, the sound of order, the sound that demanded the day begin. Antonio kept his eyes tight shut, letting the waves of sound wash over him, knowing that when the ringing finally stopped, the village would never be silent again. The echoes of the final bell strike dissolved into the morning heat, leaving behind a silence that felt different, thinner, expectant. Then, the first crack arrived. A wooden shutter, warped by years of salt air, groaned against its rusted hinges and swung outward. It hit the stone wall with a sharp, familiar clack. This was the trigger. From the balcony above, Antonio heard a response. Another shutter, then another, a cascading rhythm of wood against limestone, echoing up the narrow alleyway. The sounds were synchronized, a neighborhood habit honed over decades. Windows opened like eyes blinking awake. From behind the shutters, the soft murmur of morning routines bled into the street. A woman hummed a melody that carried clearly across the gap between the houses. A heavy iron bolt slid back with a metallic rasp. The village was no longer a collection of sleeping stone, but a collective organism stirring in unison. Neighbors leaned out from their respective frames, exchanging brief, rhythmic calls that cut through the cooling morning air. There was no hesitation in the sequence. Each movement was deliberate, a shared ritual of opening the home to the day. Antonio listened, counting the clacks as the entire alleyway transformed into a chorus of waking life. The morning chorus of shutters softened as the focus shifted from the windows down to the narrow veins of the alleys. A low, grinding rumble began to vibrate through the ground. It was the baker. He pushed a wooden cart loaded with fresh ciabatta, the wheels struggling against the uneven, sun-baked cobblestones. Every revolution of the rusted axle produced a rhythmic, industrial groan that echoed off the damp limestone walls. The sound was heavy, deliberate, and relentless. It did not hum. It scraped. The baker did not speak, his entire focus fixed on navigating the sharp, narrow turns where the cart threatened to wedge against the stone corners. The wood of the wheels popped and complained under the weight of the warm, flour-dusted loaves. As the cart passed directly beneath Antonio, the rhythmic clatter became a dominant force, a mechanical metronome that drowned out the distant chatter of the morning. Each stone the wheels struck sent a sharp, percussive vibration up through the alley. The baker leaned his weight into the frame, the muscles in his arms tightening with every push. The cart rattled, groaned, and finally rolled onward, leaving the sharp scent of yeast and the fading vibration of its wheels behind in the cooling air. Antonio stepped away from the ledge, his boots scuffing the cool tile as he retreated into the kitchen. The air inside smelled of stale coffee grounds and damp stone. He reached for the moka pot, his fingers finding the familiar cold ridges of the metal. He unscrewed the base, the threads grinding with a faint, dry rasp. He measured the water, poured it into the reservoir, and tightened the top with a firm, practiced twist until the seal locked. He struck a match, the sulfurous flare lighting the gas burner with a quick, blue pop. He placed the pot centered over the flame. For a long moment, there was only the sound of the gas venting and the faint, rhythmic pulse of his own breathing. Then, the water began to churn. A low, bubbling sound vibrated through the metal handle. It escalated quickly, sharpening into a high-pitched, insistent hiss as the dark liquid forced its way through the filter. Steam curled upward, smelling of roasted beans and heat. Antonio grabbed a chipped ceramic cup from the rack, held it under the spout, and watched the thick, dark stream fill the bottom. The hiss reached a final, piercing peak before he yanked the pot from the fire, leaving the room suddenly, sharply quiet. Antonio stood by the open window, the ceramic cup warming his palms. The coffee was bitter and thick, a sharp contrast to the cooling morning air. He looked out at the narrow alleyway, where the shadows were still long and gray against the limestone. The silence lasted only a moment before it was punctured by a voice. 3 houses down, a shutter slammed back against the exterior wall with a dull wooden thud. A woman leaned out, her upper body framed by the rectangular opening. She did not lower her voice. She shouted a greeting that bounced off the opposing stone face and returned to Antonio as a distinct, clear echo. It was a rapid, cascading sequence of vowels that filled the entire space between the buildings. Antonio tilted his head, listening to the rhythm of her call. He did not retreat or seek privacy. Instead, he stepped closer to the sill and replied, his own voice joining the chorus. The exchange was not a conversation, but a communal acknowledgement of the day's arrival. The air vibrated with the collision of their words, bouncing back and forth until the sound finally dissipated into the rafters. In this village, a door or a window was never a barrier. It was merely a bridge for the sound of a life lived entirely in public. The morning air grew warmer, drawing the heat out of the limestone walls. Antonio watched the alley floor. For a heartbeat, the path was empty, a ribbon of gray stone trapped between the houses. Then, the silence broke. It started as a frantic, staccato rhythm, a rapid-fire slapping of soles against the sun-baked ground. 3 children bolted into view, their feet hitting the cobbles with a sharp, percussive force that echoed up toward the balconies. They did not slow down. They wove through the narrow space, their bodies leaning into the turns, their laughter clipped and breathless. The sound of their sneakers was like a drum beat, a fast, syncopated rhythm that made the ground feel alive. Antonio leaned over the railing, tracking their movement until they vanished around a sharp corner near the square. Their passage left a trail of kinetic energy in the narrow passage. The rhythmic slapping of their heels lingered in the air, a fading pulse that signaled the village was no longer waking up. It was moving. The stone seemed to hold the vibration for a moment longer, a reminder of the speed and urgency that now defined the morning. Antonio set his cup down, the sharp sound of ceramic on stone marking the end of his quiet start. Antonio remained by the balcony, his focus shifting away from the departing children. He closed his eyes, tilting his head to capture the new baseline of the morning. In the city, he would have expected the low, constant thrum of engines or the piercing intrusion of a distant siren. Here, there was only the wind moving through the laundry lines and the distant, rhythmic scraping of a broom against stone. He held his breath, waiting for a mechanical disturbance, but none came. The silence was not empty. It was filled with the texture of living. There were no combustion engines to grind against the peace. no electric hums to blur the edges of the day. Every sound that reached his ears had a physical source, a human hand, a footfall, a tool guided by muscle and intent. It was a rare, heavy comfort to exist in a space where the soundtrack was entirely organic. He realized then that the absence of modern noise was the village's true foundation. It allowed him to hear the world as it had been for centuries, unbuffered by the layers of industrial static. He leaned back against the warm stone, letting the pure, unvarnished sounds of the morning wash over him, finding a deep, resonant calm in the realization that here, life was measured only by the pulse of the people around him. By high noon, the village square had shed its morning calm. It was now a theater of raw commerce, crowded and loud. Antonio stood in the deep shade of a stone archway, watching the transformation. The air felt heavier, thick, with the scent of sun-baked produce. Farmers moved through the center, their faces set in grim lines of concentration as they maneuvered horse-drawn carts over the uneven, sloping cobblestones. Every movement was a struggle against gravity and resistance. Two men heaved a crate of tomatoes from the back of a cart, their muscles straining, their boots digging into the stone for leverage. The wood of the crate groaned under the weight. A sharp, splintering sound that cut through the murmur of the crowd. Another farmer followed, dragging a stack of wooden boxes that skidded across the ground with a harsh, rhythmic screech. The intensity of the labor was palpable. There was no grace in the work, only the brute, physical reality of moving goods through a narrow, ancient space. Antonio watched the crates tilt, the handlers bracing their backs against the shifting load, their breath coming in short, ragged bursts. The square was no longer a place of rest. It was a machine of human effort, grinding and shifting under the weight of the midday harvest. Just as the crate hauling began to lull, a new sound erupted from the center of the piazza. The fishmonger stepped onto a wooden stool, his presence eclipsing the farmers and their produce. He didn't just speak. He threw his voice against the limestone walls, a jagged, relentless barrage of prices and catchphrases. He shouted about the morning catch, the silver scales still glistening in the heat, his hands gesturing with rhythmic, forceful intensity. The noise was suffocating. It pushed into every corner of the square, forcing the earlier murmurs of commerce to retreat. He took a deep, rattling breath and bellowed again, his throat straining against the effort. The sound hit the buildings, bounced back, and collided with itself. He pushed harder, his face reddening, his neck veins bulging with the sheer demand of his task. Then the inevitable happened. As he reached for a final, piercing pitch to command the attention of the back rows, his voice cracked. It was a sharp, dry snap of sound that left the air vibrating for a heartbeat. The square went quiet, the sudden absence of his roar feeling heavier than the noise itself. He didn't stop, though. He cleared his throat, spat, and started again, his voice rasping but louder than ever, reclaiming his hold on the space. The fishmonger's rasp finally settled, but the square found no peace. Near the center of the piazza, a tight circle of men had formed around a stack of dusty glass bottles. The air here was not thick with salt, but with the sharp, acidic tang of dispute. Two men stood chest to chest, the distance between them shrinking with every passing second. They were arguing over the price of olive oil, their voices rising in a jagged, competitive harmony. One man tapped his finger against the palm of his other hand, a rhythmic punctuation to his demands. The other countered by thrusting his palms upward, fingers splayed wide in a dramatic arc that traced the heat-distorted air. They did not look at the bottles. They looked only at each other, their eyes narrow and unblinking. The volume escalated. A third man leaned in, his voice joining the fray, adding a sharp, staccato layer of indignation. They gestured wildly, arms cutting through the space between them as if physically carving out their territory. Their movements were forceful, urgent, and entirely consuming. The surrounding chatter began to wane, drawn into the gravity of the clash. They were not merely talking, they were performing a ritual of social friction, their voices clashing against the limestone in a crescendo of stubborn pride that dominated the afternoon light. The shouting over the oil bottles collapsed as quickly as it had ignited. The men drifted apart, their dramatic gestures smoothing into the casual drift of the afternoon. Antonio stepped back from the heat of the square, retreating into the cool, dark shade of a stone archway. He needed the quiet. He found it near the tailor shop, where the doors stood wide open to the street. Inside, the tailor sat hunched, his hands guiding a heavy fabric under the needle. Then the sound began. A steady, mechanical chug-chug-chug. It was not hurried, it was not aggressive, it was a perfect, unwavering metronome. Each stroke of the machine punctuated the air with a dry, rhythmic precision. The clatter of the market, the footfalls, the distant chatter, the shifting crates, all seemed to align itself to this internal clock. Antonio leaned his shoulder against the rough limestone, eyes half closed. The machine pulled the thread, looped the stitch, and moved forward, never faltering. It was a hypnotic pulse that drew the chaotic energy of the square into a slow, steady rhythm. The afternoon heat hung heavy, but the sound of the sewing machine kept the village anchored, turning the frantic commerce of the day into something measured, deliberate, and undeniably constant. The sun hit the western ridge, and the sharp, white glare of the afternoon surrendered to a soft, golden haze. The tailor stopped his machine. The silence that followed was heavy, expectant, and absolute. Then, the first shutters creaked shut, followed by the clatter of bolts sliding into place. The village was shedding its skin of commerce. Antonio pushed off the stone archway and stepped into the open air. He felt the shift immediately. Doors were opening again, not for business, but for the ritual. People emerged from the cool interiors, their movements purposeful and unhurried. From every narrow alleyway, heads appeared, then shoulders, then full figures. They moved in one direction. A neighbor stepped out, nodded to Antonio, and fell into stride beside him. Another joined from a side street, then another. It was a slow, steady migration. The individual sounds of the day, the shouting, the hammering, the mechanical chug, faded, replaced by the collective rustle of fabric and the soft shuffle of leather on stone. The stream of people grew thicker, merging into a single, flowing river of movement. They were no longer farmers, tailors, or merchants. They were the village, moving toward the heart of the piazza, united by the simple, ancient gravity of the evening hour. The cobblestones of the main thoroughfare acted as a sounding board for the evening gathering. Every step taken by the hundreds of people created a rhythmic percussion that echoed off the high, limestone walls. Antonio walked with his hand lightly brushing the shoulder of his neighbor. The pace was dictated not by speed, but by the shared intention of the group. He listened as the individual scuffs and clicks merged into a single, rolling wave of sound. It was a deep, resonant cadence, a heartbeat of leather meeting stone. Families moved in tight, synchronized clusters, arm in arm, their gait perfectly matched to those around them. When a father slowed his stride to allow a child to catch up, the entire line behind him adjusted in an unbroken, fluid response. There was no stutter in the movement, no discord in the noise. It was a physical manifestation of a long-held tradition, a repetition passed down through generations. Antonio looked at the feet of the people ahead, watching the synchronized lift and strike of heels on the worn pavement. The collective sound rose, steady and assured, drowning out the lingering memory of the day's labor and replacing it with the profound, grounding hum of a community in perfect rhythmic alignment. The rhythmic percussion of hundreds of feet against the stone began to thin, not in volume but in intent. A sudden sharp chord cut through the evening air, vibrating off the narrow walls. It was a piano, played with a deliberate, slow-handed grace from an open window high above the square. The melody tumbled down into the street, layering over the shuffle of leather and the low hum of conversation. Antonio felt the change in the crowd before he saw it. The collective pace slackened, shoulders dropped. The hurried, purposeful stride of the walk softened into a gentle drift. The music did not compete with the environment. It claimed it, wrapping around the stone buildings and the people below like a cooling shroud. Each note hung in the air, forcing a pause in the chatter. A woman near the center of the piazza stopped walking. her head tilted toward the sound, her fingers tracing the air in time with the rhythm. The melody turned the mundane act of strolling into something fragile and suspended. It was no longer just a walk. It was a performance of patience. The music pulled the village together, pulling the focus away from the ground and toward the shared, invisible weight of the song, turning the evening into a moment of collective stillness. She slammed a large, steaming ceramic bowl onto the wooden table, with a force that rattled the nearby glasses.